Hello, I'm Jen Moore, Music of the Baroque's program annotator, and welcome to Baroque Notes, our series of virtual pre-concert talks. I remember quite well when Dame Jane Glover concocted the title for our November concerts. We were in Executive Director Declan McGovern's office, and we were creating the 23-24 season. Jane was outlining the repertoire she had selected for the November program: Mozart's Horn Concerto, Hmmel's Bassoon Concerto, the third suite from Handel's Water Music. And then she said with a gleam in her eye, we could call the program Windy City. I can't do her voice. Sorry. One of the wonderful things about Jane is that she has a great sense of humor. When I started doing research for the program notes, my point of departure then was this nickname, Windy City. I always thought that it referred to Chicago politics because of the heightened rhetoric around the competition between New York and Chicago for the 1893 World's Fair. I learned, however, that references to the term existed in the 1880s and even the late 1870s, and most likely referred to the wind off Lake Michigan after all. But what I found even more striking were the number of connections between the composers on the program. As the oldest, Handel is a bit of an outlier, but Balone, Hmel, Mozart, and Haydn have many fascinating points of intersection, and this is what I'll focus on during the course of my talk. First, let's touch briefly on Handel's water music. In 1714, Georg Ludwig, the Elector of Hanover, arrived in London to become the King of England. He became known almost immediately for his patronage of music and his love of sumptuous, elaborate parties, and not surprisingly, he embraced the English tradition of concerts on the River Thames. According to one contemporary report, the king expressed to Baron Kilmansegg his desire to have a concert on the river by subscription, similar to the masquerades this winter, which the king never failed to attend. Handel composed at least part of the water music in 1717 for one of these occasions. By all accounts, it was a rousing success. As one of the guests later reported, the music had been composed specially by the famous Handel, a native of Halle and His Majesty's principal court composer. His Majesty approved of it so greatly that he caused it to be repeated 3 times in all, although each performance lasted an hour, namely twice before and once after supper. The weather in the evening was all that could be desired for the festivity, the number of barges, and above all, with boats filled with people desirous of hearing, was beyond counting. Water music consists of 3 orchestral suites. While the first and second suites employ loud instruments that match the challenging outdoor acoustic, the third suite uses much softer instruments like the recorder and flute, prompting the theory that it may have been played at the dinner following the voyage rather than on the river itself. Let's listen to a little bit of the second minuet, which is gentle and soft, both in instrumentation and in its lilting melody. When Handel died in 1759, Balone was a teenager. Hmel was decades away from being born. Mozart was a toddler, and Haydn was in his mid-20s. As I mentioned, all of these composers ended up meeting in unusual ways. Joseph Balone was born in 1745 on the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe to Nanon, an enslaved woman of Senegalese origin, and Georges de Balone, a French plantation owner. Joseph's father took responsibility for his development in education and placed him in a French boarding school in 1753. Georges de Balone and Nanon followed their son to France 2 years later, and the trio moved into an apartment in Paris. In 1757, Georges became a gentleman of the King's Chamber, serving as a personal assistant to King Louis XV. When he was 13, Balone entered what is basically the Royal Academy of Fencing and Horsemanship. According to one report, at 15, Balone's progress was so rapid that he was already beating the best swordsmen, and at 17, he developed to the greatest speed imaginable. When he became a gendarme du roi, officer of the king's bodyguard, and a chevalier, knight, upon his graduation in 1766, Balone became known as le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. We know much less about Balone's musical education. In 1772, he made a sensational solo debut with Les Concerts des Amateurs, an ensemble comprised of professional and amateur musicians, playing 2 concertos he wrote for himself. As the French newspaper Mercure de France proclaimed, these concertos were performed by the author, who received great applause as much for their performance as for their composition. Balone was named conductor of the orchestra a year later. He eventually became the director of Le Concert Olympique, which was essentially the house orchestra for the Freemasons' Lodge. Mozart and Haydn were also members of the secret society. Count d'Agny, the Grand Master of the Freemasons in Paris, commissioned Haydn to write a series of symphonies for the lodge. It was Balone who brokered the deal and edited Haydn's manuscripts for publication. In 1786, Balone also directed the premiere of Haydn's Paris Symphonies, with Marie Antoinette herself in the audience. Mozart later called the works concert essentials. Balone wrote 2 symphonies that exist today. In the summer of 1778, Balone and Mozart lived in the same building in Paris for about a month. Although there is no evidence that they met, it seems impossible that they did not. In 2022, we presented the Midwest premiere of Bill Barclay's concert theater work, The Chevalier, which imagines what their interactions would have been like. Here's a bit of the first movement of Balone Symphony No. 2 from that premiere, which we'll perform on Windy City, followed by an excerpt from the scene in which Balone and Mozart first meet.
Doors of a Paris mansion crash open.
What in heavens, Joseph?
Jesus Christ! I'm sorry to cuss, madame.
You can be sorry about the door.
Son George, please. This man is urgently ill.
Who is it? Good God, quickly, give him to me.
Clear this table now.
He says his mother is dead. Forgive me, I thought you could procure the king's doctor.
How did you know I lived here?
How did I what?
Who else knows? Are you with the Black Police? Speak!
Monsieur, I live next door.
Come here. Up you go, right in the stable. I had no idea he was in France. Well, are you just going to stand there?
Tell me he will live. Do you even know who this is?
Thank you for your time tonight, Baron. May I remunerate your troubles?
It's quite all right. Liberté, Chevalier.
Again, that is a purely fictional account. We've connected Balone with Haydn and Mozart in Paris. Now on to Hmel. Hmel may have known Mozart best of all. He knew him very, very well because he began taking composition and piano with him when he was 8 years old and actually lived with Mozart and his wife Constanza in Vienna. Mozart recognized Hmmel's talent and told his father to take his son on a European tour. Hmel ended up in London for 4 years and was in the city when Haydn arrived in 1791, the year the Miracle Symphony was performed. Haydn composed a sonata for the 12-year-old pianist, which Hmel performed for him in the Hanover Square Rooms, the performance location of all of Haydn's London symphonies, plus the annual benefit performance of Handel's Messiah for the Royal Society of Musicians from 1785 to 1848. After Hmel performed Haydn's sonata, Haydn reportedly thanked Hmel and gave him a guinea. Hmel succeeded Haydn at the court of Esterhazy upon his retirement in 1804, and he later held jobs at court in Stuttgart and Weimar, but he never quite lived up to his early promise. As one scholar described his career, Hmmel's music reached the highest level accessible to one who lacks ultimate musical genius. Discovered in the 1950s in the British Museum archives, the bassoon concerto is thought to date from around 1805, when the bassoon underwent a series of changes. His famous trumpet concerto was written for similar reasons. Mozart's influence is audible throughout the work, which is highly challenging for the soloist. The opening Allegro Moderato begins with a full orchestral section that's quite long and introduces both main themes before the soloist enters. Hmel takes full advantage of the bassoon's wide melodic range and special capabilities. Let's listen to a little bit of this movement. We're going to cut in partway through the lengthy introduction so that we catch the bassoon entrance. Mozart composed 6 horn concertos between 1781 and 1791, only 3 of which are complete. They were probably written for his good friend and virtuoso horn player Joseph Leutgeb. Leutgeb also knew Haydn well. He worked with him in Esterhazy, and Haydn's wife was godmother to Leutgeb's daughter. A Salzburg native, Leutgeb eventually moved to Vienna, where he worked as a musician and a cheesemonger with a shop, quote, the size of a snail's shell, end quote. As the concerto manuscripts reveal, Mozart enjoyed playing tricks on his obviously good-natured friend. The autograph score of the second horn concerto is famously inscribed, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart took pity of Leutgeb, ass, ox, and fool, at Vienna, 27 May 1783, while Mozart wrote a string of insults above the horn part in his incomplete first horn concerto. The fourth horn concerto manuscript is also unusual. It's written in red, green, blue, and black ink. Here's a picture of an extant fragment. The inscription on the top reads, Wranitzky knows where the rest of this complete work is, namely with Leutgeb. The color has faded quite a bit with time, but it's still possible to make out the different inks. This has been interpreted both as humor aimed at Leutgeb and possibly as color-coded instructions dictating dynamics and nuance. The solo part, written for Waldhorn or natural horn, is particularly challenging, incorporating many stopped notes or notes played with the right hand inserted in the instrument's bell, and low notes reached by overblowing, which was one of Leutgeb's trademark skills. Finally, we come to Haydn, who is directly connected to all of the composers on the program. Haydn traveled to London for the first time in 1791 at the request of German violinist and London impresario Johann Peter Salomon, who was launching a public concert series. Haydn was promised £300 for an opera, £300 for 6 symphonies, and additional money for publication rights and other compositions. The city of London embraced the composer. As Haydn wrote to a friend, "Everyone wants to know me. I had to dine out 6 times up to now, and if I wanted, I could dine out every day. But first, I must consider my health, and second, my work." Symphony number 96 is the first London symphony Haydn wrote, although it is the 4th according to number, as the set begins with Symphony number 93 and concludes with 104. It was first performed in the Hanover Square Rooms on March 11th, 1791, and it's subtitled the Miracle Symphony because at its premiere, a chandelier apparently fell from the ceiling. It could have been a disaster, but the floor below was empty because the audience had rushed the stage to get close to Haydn, almost like a rock star today. When I was searching YouTube for recordings of the symphony, I found a video that had lots of references to a Japanese manga series that started in 2021 called Ran Komonohashi Deranged Detective. As it turns out, Ran refers to Symphony number 96 in one of the cases he solves. A 6th-generation descendant of Sherlock Holmes, the deranged detective, is in a hotel during an investigation when a chandelier falls. Music starts playing. Recognizing it as Haydn's Symphony number 96, Ron realizes what just happened was no accident. The reference actually led quite a few manga fans to listen to Haydn's work, which was reflected in the YouTube comments. Like so many symphony subtitles, The Miracle is not entirely accurate. Recent research shows that while the event happened, it took place in 1795 during the premiere of Symphony number 102. Haydn's symphonies are often known for their wit and subtlety. When he composed the London symphonies, however, he had to adjust this style for the larger performance space, making his musical gestures larger and more obvious so they would be audible in the acoustic. One of my favorite descriptions of this is that the London symphonies are written with an artist's brush rather than an engraver's tool. Let's listen to a bit of the 3rd movement, a minuet. There's something so vivid and personal for me about these vibrant social circles in European capital cities. In Paris, Joseph Balone worked with Haydn and probably met Mozart. In Vienna, Hmel lived and studied with Mozart. Mozart wrote his horn concertos for Leutgeb, who knew Haydn very well. And in 1791 in London, Haydn wrote a piano sonata for the teenage Hmel, sent there by Mozart, and premiered the very first London symphony, the Miracle Symphony, all in the same space that benefit performances of Handel's Messiah were being given yearly. I hope this context brings this music to life in the same way for you as you enjoy Windy City, November 19th at the North Shore Center in Skokie, November 20th at the Harris Theater in downtown Chicago, and on demand until December 24th. Thank you so much.